When the first tablets were lifted from the dust near ancient Eridu and Nippur, their messages seemed oddly incomplete, like pages torn from a much larger book. Scribes had etched familiar hymns and king lists, but interwoven among them were strange directional phrases: path of return, stations of Enlil, heavenly domains of Ninurta. These weren't poetic flourishes, they sounded navigational, and across dozens of sites, these cosmic references kept appearing. The Sumerians, it seemed, were quietly mapping not just Earth, but a network that may have once included other worlds. The name we know best is Anunnaki, beings described not as abstract deities, but as administrators, emissaries, and occasionally rebels. Their stories don't simply tell of Earth's formation. They imply arrival, assignment, even conflict. And buried in the lines of temple inventories, in prayers for safe passage, in songs to forgotten skies, is the suggestion that Earth was never the center of their story, just one outpost, one station among others. Welcome. I'm truly glad you're here tonight. If it's late where you are, or if the day left your thoughts tangled, you're not alone. This is a quiet space, one made for slow thoughts, soft questions, and the kind of wonder that doesn't demand certainty. I'm grateful to be keeping you company, and I think, once we begin, you might see the stars a little differently. What makes this story extraordinary is how it hides in plain sight. The idea that the Anunnaki had other colonies isn't some single, wild theory. It comes from patterns, temple hymns referencing gatherings in distant fields, ritual texts noting those who returned from Ma, and star charts far more advanced than expected for 2100 BCE. Most scholars read these as symbolic, metaphors for celestial cycles or spiritual return. But a growing number ask, what if they're not symbolic at all? The mainstream view remains cautious. The Anunnaki, they say, were gods in the mythic sense, personifications of natural forces, encoded into cultural memory. And yet, the Sumerians described them with disarming literalness. They named their homes, tracked their movements, documented their departures. Some researchers propose that what we've called myth may preserve memory, filtered through ritual, recorded in clay, a memory of visitors who came, taught, ruled, and left, and maybe not just from the stars, but to other places beyond Earth. We won't be settling that debate tonight, and truthfully, we don't need to. The goal isn't to prove anything, it's to notice, to wonder, to hold fragments of ancient thought up to the starlight and ask softly, what if they remembered something we've forgotten? So, take a breath with me. Wherever you're listening from, curled under blankets, stretched out in the dark, maybe just watching the sky from a quiet window. This moment is yours. Let your hands relax. Let your shoulders ease. You don't have to solve the mystery. You just have to be here for it. And if this story speaks to you, if you find value in these meditative journeys through forgotten stone and sky, I'd be honored if you'd leave a like or follow along. It helps others find their way to these quiet corners of history. Now let's step into it. The soil of southern Mesopotamia is dry, cracked, and filled with salt. But beneath its surface, the oldest stories in human language still rest, waiting. Stories not only of harvest and law, but of movement, across stars, across roles, across boundaries. The temple walls of Ur speak of the bond between heaven and earth. The ziggurat of Nana aligns with a path that vanishes into the night sky. And in Enki's watery shrine, the priests once whispered of Dilmun, a land that could not be found on any map. Maybe they weren't just speaking of paradise. Maybe they were remembering a destination or a departure. And in that possibility, we begin. When the wind swept across southern Mesopotamia 8,000 years ago, it tasted of salt and sand. Bitter from evaporated floodwaters, edged with the warmth of a sun that showed no mercy. No kings had risen, no ziggurats had touched the sky. The land was a low, shifting plain, flat, briny, and waiting. Its only rulers were rivers. Its only monuments were the stars. Long before the Anunnaki were named, before Enki was assigned the earth, this region existed as a crucible of change. Planetary conditions were harsh, but not lifeless. Between 10,000 BCE and 5,000 BCE, the Fertile Crescent was shaped by the withdrawal of Ice Age glaciers and the slow northward creep of subtropical air masses. Seasonal floods from the Zagros Mountains poured into the basin, leaving behind layers of silt that built the southern alluvium grain by grain. Every spring, the rivers expanded, devouring their banks, carving new channels, retreating with heat, and in their wake came life. Beneath this geological theater, the Arabian Plate moved steadily north, pressing into the Eurasian Plate, raising the Zagros Range by millimeters per year. Earthquakes were rare, but deep. The crust flexed. The pressure below shifted heat into pockets that warmed the groundwater, birthing what later myth would call the Abzu, the cosmic deep beneath the land, the watery underworld of creation. In Sumerian thought, this wasn't metaphor. It was geography made sacred. Above it all, the sky remained unchanged, still, predictable in a way the earth never was. The stars became a calendar before they ever became gods. By 5000 BCE, Ubaidara observers were already tracking celestial cycles, not with telescopes, but with memory. They noticed that Sirius rose when floodwaters came, that Orion's belt shifted just before the heat broke, that the moon waxed longest near Barley's golden peak. When the night cooled the mud of temporary reed houses, they looked upward not with fear, but with recognition, and slowly, with reverence. Perhaps that is where the idea began, that the heavens weren't just canvas, but origin, that what moved above must also rule below. Long before names like An or Enlil were spoken, the notion of cosmic hierarchy had taken root, that stars governed rains, that eclipses foretold changes, that the sky was a realm of power, while earth was a realm of labor, a place where beings might descend, not because it was sacred, but because it was assigned. By the time the first Sumerian scribes etched cuneiform into clay around 3100 BCE, these ideas had already matured. Their cosmology divided existence into three great tiers: An, the high heavens; Kai, the earth and its surface life; and Kur, the deep land below, cold, silent, and ambiguous. Sometimes Kur meant underworld, sometimes it meant mountain, sometimes it meant the other side of wherever one stood. An was where destinies were fixed. Kai was where they unfolded. Kur was where they were buried. In this triad, Earth was not supreme. It was transitional, a zone of placement, of experimentation, of burden, and perhaps of exile. The Sumerian creation stories do not portray humanity as sacred. We were formed by the gods, yes, but for labor. In texts like the Atrahasis, mankind is shaped from clay and divine blood not to rule, but to relieve the gods of toil, farming, irrigation, grain counting. Our value was function. What kind of creator makes life not to flourish, but to serve? One interpretation suggests this was simply how the Sumerians saw the world, through the lens of kingship, hierarchy, and duty. Another dares to ask if this reflected memory, a half-kept story of arrival, of assignment, of someone coming from On down to Ki, through the gates of Kur, to begin again on a new world. And in that structure, and above, Kai between, Kur below, we see a model not only of the cosmos, but of colonization, a three-tiered system with messengers and laws descending, and burdens rising back up. Take a breath with me here. Imagine the sky above you, as dark as oil, yet sharp with pinpricks of frozen fire. Imagine no cities, no roads, only salt wind, low marsh, and the rhythmic slap of reeds. Now, imagine one of those stars moving in a way it shouldn't, not circling, not blinking, but approaching. What would you call it? A sign? A chariot? A god? And how would you preserve that moment if you didn't yet have writing? The Sumerians answered with cosmology. They structured their world in a way that made sense of power descending, in a way that allowed for the idea that Earth was never first, never central, just one field among many, in a system where assignments were given from above, and loyalty was expected from below. Somewhere between tectonic plates and lunar calendars, between rivers and radiance, that idea endured. The sky, after all, changes slowly, but not forgetfully. And soon, someone would name the gods who came through it. When the wind swept across the alluvial plains of ancient Mesopotamia, before temples rose, before tablets were etched, there were watchers, not astronomers in the modern sense, not yet priests, just quiet figures beneath open skies, learning the rhythm of the stars, not by theory, but by waiting. Long before the names An, Enlil, and Enki were whispered in temple courtyards, the heavens were already speaking, and someone was listening. Night in Mesopotamia came like a tide, slow, hushed, and overwhelming. The air cooled fast. The sharp smell of dried rushes gave way to the weight of damp soil. Above, the constellations revealed themselves with such clarity. It was as though the sky were a ceiling of obsidian, pricked open to another world. By 6000 BCE, the Ubaid people, the predecessors of the Sumerians, had begun to observe not just brightness, but pattern. They saw that certain stars rose just before the rivers swelled, that Venus appeared low on the horizon days before the first winds of seasonal shift. They didn't record these things yet, but they remembered them, and memory, before myth, is the first form of cosmology. Perhaps you felt it too. The tug of awe when you see a star where you didn't expect one. The quiet certainty that someone else must have noticed it long ago. The Ubaid settlements at Tel al-Ubaid, Eridu, and later Ur show early signs of communal order. Aligned longhouses, shared courtyards, shrines with deliberate orientation. Archaeologists believe some of these structures aligned with lunar or solar events. The orientation of doorways toward solstices, the placement of hearths to receive morning light only in certain months, suggests more than convenience. It suggests reverence, or maybe memory. Memory of what the sky had once done, or what had once come from it. Some scholars have pointed to the recurring Sumerian term, Duranki, the bond of heaven and earth. In the oldest contexts, it refers to Nippur, believed to be the navel of the world, where divine command passed down. But its syntax, dur, bond, and heaven, ki, earth, reads less like metaphor and more like engineering. A connection point, a junction. Was it simply poetic? Or might it hint at a literal belief that something had once linked the sky to the ground? By 4000 BCE, people along the southern rivers had begun cataloging time through sky events. They tracked the helical rising of stars. They noted eclipses. They divided the year into segments based on celestial returns. These weren't merely calendars, they were assignments. The Sumerians would later name these sky patterns, the Bull of Heaven, the Scorpion, the Loyal Shepherd. Their myths wrapped around the constellations like stories hugging memory. But the stars came first. And for them, the stars were not just decoration. They were roots, hierarchies, stations. In later Sumerian texts, particularly those found at Sippar and Nineveh, we see not only constellations, but star lists, mule apin, that detail risings, settings, positions by season, and strange anomalies. One entry mentions a wandering star that does not return, a phrase that some modern researchers have interpreted as a possible record of a comet, or perhaps an object behaving unexpectedly, moving without orbit, arriving. Could it be that before the gods were imagined as personalities, they were witnessed as phenomena? When the Sumerians named the Anunnaki, they did so with the confidence of inheritance. These were not new ideas. These were remembered assignments. Enlil, who ruled air and command. Enki, who ruled water and knowledge. Ninhursag, who governed the living earth. But more intriguing is how those roles aligned with celestial patterns. Enlil's star path matched that of the northern sky arc. Enki was associated with the south, the deep, the stars near the Di Antao, watery horizon. Their homes were not just temples, but zones of the sky. Perhaps that's why Sumerian ziggurats were built in layers. Each tier, broad, precise, angled, echoed the heavens in shape and function, not just as places of prayer, but as replicas of the star's descent. One structure, rising. One purpose, contact. Breathe with me, not to rush past this moment, but to pause inside it, because something profound happens when a civilization stops asking what the stars are and starts asking who placed them. That shift, from passive observation to personified purpose, may be the oldest spark of belief, and it's here that the Anunnaki enter the story. Not as abstractions, not as storms or winds turned divine, but as names tied to stars, stations, duties, departures. We'll explore their roles in later sections. But for now, consider this. Before the gods arrived in story, they may have arrived in sky, or perhaps more accurately, someone came, and in their coming, they left echoes, the kind only visible after dark, the kind only preserved by stillness, the kind we still follow, even now, when we look up. When the first Sumerian tablets were unburied from the dust near Eridu and Nippur, the line appeared again and again, quiet but resolute. When kingship descended from heaven, not emerged, not was chosen, but descended. The phrasing was deliberate. Earth, they believed, was not the source of power. It was the recipient. A station, not central, not sovereign, assigned within a cosmic order far older than human memory, long before the Anunnaki ruled temples, before Enlil's name echoed across courtrooms and Enki's waters flowed through the Abzu. Earth itself had been claimed, not by its people, by its position. By the time we reach the early dynastic period, around 2900 BCE, the idea of assignment was baked into every ritual. The heavens were stratified into three domains: An, the celestial heavens; Ki, the terrestrial plane; and Kur, the deep unseen regions beneath. But this wasn't just cosmological poetry, it was operational. The gods didn't live in vague clouds. They had zones, specific jurisdictions, and Earth, Kai, was Enki's to manage. The Enuma Elish, a Babylonian echo of earlier Sumerian cosmologies, reinforces this structure. Anu ruled above. Enlil commanded the winds and decrees. Enki, also called Ea, was sent to Earth, not out of love, but of duty. A territory had been given, a base had been formed. Earth was a task, and Enki, for reasons not fully preserved, accepted it. Eridu, his city, was the first. Located in the deep south of Mesopotamia, near the edges of the Persian Gulf, Eridu's foundation is among the oldest known urban settlements. Layer upon layer, dating back to 5400 BCE, reveals structures built over the same sacred point, what would eventually become the Abzu Temple. Scholars from the British Museum and University of Baghdad, excavating Eridu in the mid-20th century, found no random sprawl. The site was deliberate, central, aligned with celestial points and hydrological features. Its construction materials, mud brick hardened with reed mats, gypsum plaster, and later fired clay, were not advanced. But its position was sophisticated, chosen near an aquifer, elevated just above seasonal floods, geometrically centered between shifting river deltas and distant mountain silhouettes. Not just a shrine, a node, a base of operations. Sumerian hymns describe Enki's arrival not as creation, but as activation. The Abzu beneath Eridu was unsealed, the chambers opened, the commands spoken. The Abzu, both a literal water table and a symbolic deep, was treated as a cosmic processor. Enki's temple wasn't simply where rituals occurred, it was where directives were issued. Perhaps that's why ziggurats rose where they did. Each was a terrestrial anchor, fixed in alignment with astral reference points. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, constructed around 2100 BCE, was aligned not to magnetic north, but to the cardinal rise of Venus. The Ikur of Nippur sat at what the Sumerians considered the exact center of the world. Their term for it? Dur-Dan-Ki, the bond between heaven and earth. Not a metaphor, a location, a plug in the socket. Sumerian king lists reinforce this framework. They don't begin with names of tribal leaders or ancestral founders. They begin with gods, and they begin from above. After each cataclysm or flood, the record says the kingship was lowered again, not restored, lowered, as if brought down intentionally from somewhere else, as if Earth wasn't permitted to govern itself without instruction. It's a concept not of evolution, but deployment. Take a breath here with me, because this changes something. When a civilization frames Earth not as the origin point, but as the recipient of roles, then humanity itself is seen not as native, but drafted, not chosen for greatness, but assigned labor. In Atrahasis, the gods grow tired of work, they revolt, and in response, a solution is designed. Humans, formed from clay and divine blood, not to rule, but to serve. Our earliest mythologies describe our purpose not as enlightenment, but as relief. That's a different kind of beginning. And yet, the system wasn't cruel. It was structured. Earth had purpose. People had roles. The gods had zones. And each location, from the cities of Uruk and Lagash to the deep canals of Girsu, was organized to reflect the layout of something larger, something remembered, or still in effect. The Anunnaki were not free agents. They were deployable intelligences. Their realms assigned, their responsibilities cataloged. One Sumerian text even refers to a divine census, an enumeration of assignments and postings. What kind of god requires a census? Maybe the kind that isn't eternal. Maybe the kind that reports. We don't need to leap into theories of spacecraft or blueprints. The texts don't offer that, but they do offer something equally strange: logistics, roles, timelines, authority descending, Earth receiving, power moving not in eruption, but in instruction, and always. Earth appears as the middle, between the high realm of On and the unknown depths of Kur. Earth was the processor, the place where commands were enacted, but not originated, the place where outcomes were tested, but not decided. And that framing stayed. It lived in hymns, in city planning, in law codes etched into basalt. It lived in the quiet way scribes always began with the heavens and ended with dust. Because Earth was not the goal, it was the station, and someone assigned it. When the wind rolled in from the sea during the Ubaid period, it passed over a rising platform on a salt-bitten plain, just west of where the Euphrates once curled through marsh and clay. It wasn't large, no towers yet, no priests, just a foundation of packed mud brick, raised and repaired over centuries. But beneath that surface, something had begun. Eridu. The Sumerians called it the first city, the place where kingship descended, and most importantly, Enki's home. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. Eridu was real. Its ruins excavated in the 1940s by Iraqi and British archaeologists, revealing 18 distinct architectural layers, the oldest dating to roughly 5,400 BCE. And at the center of every layer, rebuilt again and again across millennia, was the same thing: a temple, small at first, then larger, then elevated, always oriented toward the south, always tied to water. It was not merely a place of worship, it was a site of arrival. Sumerian texts describe Enki not as creator, but as descender, the god of water, wisdom, and engineering, assigned to Earth, not born from it. In the Eridu Genesis, Enki comes down to build, advised by Anu above. His temple, the Abzu, was more than a shrine. It was said to house the Mi, a mysterious set of divine laws or powers that regulated everything from kingship to speech to metallurgy. What kind of place would need to hold such tools? Archaeologists found no golden relics, no weapons, just bricks. But the layout matters. The central chamber was narrow, barely 2 meters wide, leading inward like a corridor rather than a hall. Storage pits lined the outer sections. The walls were plastered smooth with gypsum, and in later phases, recessed niches and altars appeared. But it wasn't scale that mattered. It was placement. Eridu was built before the great river cities, before Ur, before Lagash. It was far south, closer to the sea than the center of later civilization. In fact, geological studies suggest that in 5000 BCE, Eridu sat at the very edge of the Persian Gulf. The land has since extended outward through sediment, but back then, it was a port, a threshold between sea and soil, and perhaps between sky and earth. Some scholars speculate that its location was ideal for astronomical observation. The flat plain gave uninterrupted horizons. The air, dry and clear, made stars shimmer with minimal distortion. The temple's southeast orientation aligns closely with the rising of Sirius, the dog star, long associated with both flooding and arrival across multiple ancient cultures. Maybe that's why they chose this spot, or maybe it was chosen for them. Let's pause here. Just for a breath, imagine standing on that wind-swept rise 7,000 years ago. No cities around, just low huts, marsh birds, and the steady lap of brackish water. The temple, no taller than a house, rests quiet, But inside, rituals begin. Offerings are placed, prayers are spoken, and above it all, the stars move like gears. The Sumerians believed that when Enki arrived at Eridu, he activated the Abzu, the watery deep beneath the earth, described as both mythic ocean and literal groundwater. Recent geoarchaeological models confirm that beneath Eridu lies a high salinity aquifer, fed seasonally by Euphrates overflow. Accessing it would have required advanced knowledge of depth and flow, a skill set far beyond the subsistence farmers of the era. And yet, they built exactly where they needed to, not 1 kilometer off, not 50 meters, directly above. Coincidence or inherited instruction? The Abzu was more than a well. In texts like the Enki and the World Order, it is described as a source of creative energy, a place from which speech, intelligence, and life itself emerge. Some interpret this symbolically. Others have wondered if it references resonance, frequency, water's ability to store and transmit information. But all agree it was the reason Eridu mattered. Not its walls, not its size, its access. That word, access, appears again and again in early texts. Not just physical access to water, but access to order. The Mi were stored at Eridu, divine decrees, archetypes, operating systems in a sense for civilization. And it was Enki, not Enlil, who held them. Why? Because this was his post. The Sumerians are clear, the gods had assignments. Enlil ruled the airs and the fates. Ninhursag birthed life. Enki governed earth. Eridu was not just his residence, it was his headquarters. And that idea, that earth was Enki's station, appears even in later Akkadian and Babylonian reinterpretations. The title persists. The location is always the same. It was never a floating city. It never had golden walls. But Eridu didn't need spectacle. It had function. The earliest cities didn't rise for trade. They rose to fulfill something older, to mirror something remembered, to hold ground, in a plan set from above. As we step forward into the Golden Age, we won't see the gods build more cities. We'll see humans begin to emulate them, to mimic the divine layouts, to repeat the rituals, the structures, the symbols, even if they no longer understood why. But here, in Eridu, is where they began. Not with questions, but with instructions. When the Sumerians first recorded history, not as scattered memory, but as sequence, they began not with a human name, but with a descent. After the kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. That phrase appears at the top of the Sumerian king list, an ancient document first compiled around 2100 BCE and found in multiple copies across Nippur, Larsa, and later Nineveh. It doesn't speak of tribal lineage or social ascent. It doesn't mention agriculture or conquest. It begins with the sky. Kingship, they believed, was not developed. It was delivered. Before anything else, authority came down. What kind of civilization frames governance as a gift from the stars? And more curiously, why does the record insist that this happened not once, but multiple times? The king list tracks the lowering of kingship after each cataclysm, most notably the Great Flood. Each time, rule doesn't emerge from survivors or ingenuity. It is lowered again, as if a mechanism were reactivated, as if rule on earth was conditional and occasionally withdrawn. Let's slow here, just for a moment. Imagine you're one of the early scribes at Shurupak. You've seen floods erase fields. You've heard elders speak of a time when divine order fell silent. And now, with the riverbanks stable again, a new king has risen. But instead of celebrating human survival, you're instructed to write, "Kingship returned." not earned, not claimed, returned. This wasn't humility, it was structure. The word used in these texts, Nam-lugal, isn't just kingship, it means function of rule. And the phrase anta-ii means from heaven brought down. This was not metaphorical. In the tablets, it's recorded as logistical event, not unlike a protocol. The first listed ruler is Alulim of Eridu, said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Modern scholars agree these numbers are symbolic, likely representing lunar or seasonal cycles. But their inclusion signals something more, the desire to connect divine timing with earthly presence, a kind of resonance between above and below. Why would a king need to be delivered unless he served something more than the people? The role of the king in early Sumer was priest-king, intermediary between the city and its assigned god. In Eridu, that was Enki. In Nippur, Enlil. In Uruk, Inanna. Each city-state was linked to a specific deity, and the ruler's job was to enact their will through ritual, law, and infrastructure. The temples weren't religious buildings in the modern sense. They were command centers. The Ikur of Nippur was called the Assembly Hall of the Gods, not a place of worship, a place of gathering. Tablets found at Nippur describe decisions being made there on behalf of all the Sumerian cities. In one hymn, the gods debate the fates of nations within its walls, and it was from Nippur, not any royal capital, that the Namtar, the fates, were issued. Rule, then, was not regional, it was custodial. The king governed on behalf of a god who governed on behalf of the stars. By the time Ur-Nammu codified his law code around 2100 BCE, predating Hammurabi by centuries, the system was formal. Laws were issued in accordance with the will of Nana, the moon god. Rulership was claimed by decree of Enlil. Each royal seal bore not just names, but symbols of divine authorization. Wings, stars, solar disks, crescent moons. These weren't decorations, they were permissions. And when a king fell out of favor, whether through military failure, famine, or divine omen, he wasn't overthrown politically. He was said to have lost kingship. The heavens revoked the contract. A new descent was anticipated, sometimes from a new city, sometimes from a different god, but always from above. Take a breath here. Because this isn't just governance, it's alignment. The Sumerians saw kingship as something that had to match cosmic rhythm. Their calendars were lunar-solar hybrids. Their rituals were scheduled to star risings. The king's role was not to make law, but to express it, to mirror the divine in form, timing, and justice. This mirroring extended even to architecture. The king's throne faced temple gates that mirrored celestial movement. Processions followed the same paths year after year, aligning with solstice sunrises, equinox moonsets. Sacred drums were tuned to correspond to planetary intervals. It wasn't power, it was permission. Even rebellion followed cosmic framing. The Lamentations for Ur, written after the fall of Ur in 2004 BCE, don't blame foreign armies, they blame the gods. The gods turned their faces, it says. Kingship departed, not stolen, not lost in war. Departed. Perhaps that's the deepest belief they held, that Earth did not own rule. It borrowed it, hosted it, reacted to it. And when kingship failed, the heavens closed the circuit. We live in a world that assumes leadership arises from us. But the Sumerians believed the opposite. They waited for it to descend. When the first light of dawn broke over Ur, it did not strike the royal palace first. It struck the uppermost tier of the ziggurat. That was the point. These were not just platforms, not mere temples. They were calibrations, built to catch the sky. Ziggurats, the towering centerpieces of Sumerian city-states, were raised not only for gods, but to match them. Their construction was sacred geometry, encoded with celestial intent. To walk among them was to walk within a mirror of the heavens. Long before telescopes, long before lenses could magnify the stars, the Sumerians had another tool: repetition. They studied the way certain stars rose along the horizon during solstices, the patterns of Venus, the seasonal arc of the moon, and they built accordingly. Ziggurats were not identical across cities. Each had different proportions, different orientations, different stair placements. That variance was not error, it was alignment. The ziggurat at Ur, constructed around 2100 BCE by Ur-Nammu, was dedicated to Nana, the moon god. It aligned with the lunar calendar. Its stairways faced celestial markers associated with Nana's path. In Babylon, the ziggurat at Temenanki, later interpreted as the Tower of Babel, was tied to Marduk and his associated star groupings. In Eridu, the temple platform was attuned to the southern skies and the rising of Sirius, long connected to Enki's watery domain. These were not merely shrines. They were replications of where the gods came from, and where perhaps they might return. Take a moment. Picture the skyline of a Sumerian city from afar. The dwellings are low, mud brick rectangles clustered along canals and dusty lanes. But above them all, one structure rises, terraced, massive, layered in steps, its outer face painted in rich pigments, white for purity, red for blood, black for the underworld, colors chosen not at random, but in cosmic association. Each level of the ziggurat corresponded to a realm. The base was earth, the middle tiers, the atmospheric heavens, the topmost shrine, the realm of the gods. And the staircases? They weren't just for show. They were ascent lines. The Sumerians believed that gods could descend, but also that priests, in ritual, could rise. Certain ceremonies, performed only during lunar or solar alignments, required the high priest to climb to the upper chamber and wait for dream, for sign, for visitation. The ziggurat became a bridge, a controlled point of contact, a replica of the homes the gods were said to have come from. The very word for ziggurat, zikkurat, derives from the Akkadian to rise high. But in earlier Sumerian, these structures were called Eshesh, exalted house, or Egal, great house. Their orientation often matched star paths. The corners didn't face true, north, but aligned with the rising of specific constellations. Scholars have found that many ziggurats were slightly rotated off the cardinal grid, not due to construction error, but to match the sky. Perhaps these cities were more than settlements. Perhaps they were star charts in mud and stone. The city-state system itself, independent but linked by theology, mirrored a broader logic. Each city governed itself, yet acknowledged a central divine order. Like stars within a constellation, each had its own brilliance, its own orbit, but all contributed to a larger shape. Uruk, the domain of Inanna, was known for its twin temples and deep astronomical motifs. Nippur, the religious heart, housed the Ikur, the mountain house of Enlil, often considered the axis mundi, the central line connecting heaven and earth. Lagash, Girsu, Uma, all had their own gods, their own ziggurats, their own ritual calendars. And yet, all obeyed the same cycle of celestial time. Each god had a home. Each home reflected their domain, and those domains, aligned to the stars. The rituals that filled these cities weren't random spectacles. They were reenactments. At the Zagmuk festival celebrated the cosmic renewal at the winter solstice. The king ritually abdicated, chaos was invoked, then order was restored, mirroring the Sumerian cosmology of initial disorder resolved by divine assignment. The festival was timed to the sun's lowest point, then its return. The gods, the stars, the seasons, all participated. The cities, in effect, were performances, architectural liturgies. Take a breath here, because this isn't just belief, it's pattern recognition made physical. The ancients didn't separate heaven from planning, myth from measurement. Every brick laid in a ziggurat had to correspond with both earthly weight and heavenly weight. Rituals were encoded into blueprints, and those blueprints were cosmic. What does it mean when a city is designed to resemble a sky map? What kind of memory is being preserved? Some believe the cities were merely symbolic expressions of order. Others suggest they were trying to rebuild something once witnessed, a descent, a presence, a home once seen or felt, and now copied in terrestrial form. Perhaps the gods were not imagined, but remembered. Perhaps their dwellings were not invented, but modeled, and perhaps the cities themselves were invitations for return. As we step into the next section, we leave behind blueprints, we enter ritual, because next we descend into what happened inside these sacred houses, where doors were closed, fires were lit, and things were spoken not always meant for human ears. When the Sumerians spoke of their gods, they did not whisper of distant spirits or hidden forces. They spoke plainly, casually, with the same certainty you might use to describe a neighbor who once lived down the street, because to them, the gods had lived here. And not only lived, but dined, judged, wed, quarreled, punished, ruled. This was the age before separation, before divinity was sealed behind temple doors, before the stars grew silent. It was the golden age of contact, and its traces remain, in myth, in hymn, in stone. Long before the Epic of Gilgamesh was composed, stories were passed of divine kings and priestesses chosen by the gods in person. In one of the oldest myths, Enki, lord of water and wisdom, visits the goddess Inanna and gives her the sacred me, the powers that shape civilization. They do not argue from afar. They feast, they drink, they touch. The gods were not abstract. They were present. In the myth of Adapa, the sage created by Enki is summoned to heaven after breaking the wing of the south wind. He is fed bread and water by Anu himself. Not symbols, not dreams. Literal sustenance. Heavenly meals offered to a mortal, face to face. This is the world Sumer remembered, a time when the sky did not divide gods from men, but connected them. And the tools they brought? The texts describe them, but rarely explain. In Ninurta's return to Nippur, the warrior god arrives bearing shining stones that can speak, measure, fly, destroy. The Tablet of Destinies, held by Enlil or seized by others in myth, is said to grant total command of order and chaos. In Lugali, we read of divine weapons that roar like lions and flash like fire. Metaphor? Perhaps, but maybe something else. Some researchers believe these stories encode memories of lost technologies, ritualized and reframed through generations. The sky chariots of Anu, the divine boats of Inanna, and the thundering craft of Ninurta bear descriptions that suggest movement beyond biology. In texts where Inanna ascends into heaven, her journey is marked not by abstraction, but by steps, sounds, and sensations. She entered the chamber of ascent. The bolts were loosed, the platform lifted, These are not vague, spiritual metaphors. They read like logistics. Take a breath here, not to rush ahead, but to slow into wonder. Because even if we read these stories purely as theology, the consistency is striking. Across temple hymns, royal seals, and ceremonial texts spanning centuries, the same pattern appears. Divine beings came, walked among humans, left instructions, then withdrew, but not completely. Their presence lingered in rituals. In Uruk, the sacred marriage rite, Hieros Gamos, reenacted the union of Inanna and Dumuzi, with the king and high priestess assuming divine roles. This was not play acting. It was believed to renew cosmic order. During these rites, the king was not representing Dumuzi. He became him. The line between God and human blurred. In Lagash, inscriptions claim the city's laws were dictated directly by Ningirsu. At Nippur, Enlil was said to preside over judgment in person, his decisions binding even on other gods. At Eridu, priests offered water daily to Enki, not symbolically, but as hospitality. The temple was his home, and they tended it as such. This integration extended to daily life. Each profession had a patron deity. Builders prayed to Kula, the brick god, shepherds to Dumuzi. Scribal schools began with hymns to Nisaba, goddess of writing. The gods weren't separate from labor. They inhabited it. The act of baking, farming, counting, singing, each was both human and divine. Perhaps that was the most enduring trait of this golden age, its seamlessness. No separation between sacred and ordinary, only rhythm, only participation. The boundaries had not yet hardened, but that age faded. Later texts speak of departures, of gods returning to the heavens, of temples losing their voices. The lament for Ur mourns the day the gods abandoned their cities, their shrines fell silent. Something changed, slowly, then suddenly, and what had once been common became myth. Still, the memories remained, preserved in clay, carved into walls, recited across generations. Not just that the gods existed, but that they had been here, and that knowledge, however faint, never vanished. As we move into the next section, we leave the presence of the gods and descend into their tools, what they left behind, and what we may still be interpreting even now. When the sun rose over Nippur, it did so in silence, not the silence of absence, but of preparation, because in this city, this center not of commerce, but of cosmic administration, a new day meant not merely light, but alignment, and the priests were already moving. Nippur was never the largest city in Sumer. It lacked the wealth of Ur, the grandeur of Uruk, the maritime links of Eridu. But it was sacred, unchallengeably so. It was the home of Enlil, the high god of breath, wind, and decree. From Nippur, divine rulings were issued, not just to cities, but to time itself. When the Sumerians said fates were fixed, they meant it literally, here, and it was the priests of Nippur who carried out that fixing. Their day began well before sunrise. The inner courtyard of the Ikur temple, the mountain house, glowed faintly with oil lamps. Scented resin was burned. The air carried the sharp perfume of cedar ash and myrrh, clinging to the white plastered walls. Ritual garments were donned, woven linen, unmarked by status, bound with ceremonial cords that mirrored planetary paths, a central belt for the earth, loops for visible stars. The first task, opening the gate, not metaphorical, not symbolic, a literal creaking wooden gate set within the temple's eastern wall, opened precisely as the first light of day crested the horizon. It was a reenactment of the moment the gods descended to earth. a sacred repetition of an event no longer witnessed but never forgotten. These rituals were not improvised. They were choreographed, set according to a liturgical calendar that matched lunar phases, stellar risings, and the movement of Venus. On certain days, different gods were invoked. Offerings changed based on celestial events, dates, grains, oils, and stones, each chosen for resonance. Inside the Gipar, the temple residence, the chief priest read aloud the daily text. These were not sermons, they were liturgies. Each word, intoned in Sumerian meter, was believed to activate memory, not personal memory, but planetary. The remembrance of how the world had once been, when gods walked freely. Some passages describe the journeys of the divine, Enlil crossing the heaven fields, Inanna entering the 7 gates of the stars, Ninurta returning from a land beyond the mountain wall. These weren't geographical markers as we know them. They were coordinates, stored in chant, not in map. Perhaps those priests were not only worshippers. Perhaps they were record keepers. Each ritual mimicked a cosmic event. The pouring of water from a copper bowl symbolized the release of the heavenly waters. The striking of a drum 3 times at midday mirrored the divine hammer of judgment. The lighting of 3 braziers at dusk echoed the 3 realms, An, Ki, and Kur. The ceremonies were encoded, and the priests kept the code alive. The temple walls themselves bore reminders. Along the inner corridors of Ikur, mud brick reliefs depicted stars. Not random, but in accurate seasonal placements. The roof tiles were set in patterns that cast shadow lines during equinoxes. It's possible the entire temple was a kind of instrument, calibrated to mark time, echo sound, focus intention. There was a reason no king ruled from Nippur. It was not for kings. It was for orders. The city was a junction. The Durdankai, the bond of heaven and earth, was said to reside here, not metaphorically, but physically. Some texts imply that the priests believed communications from the gods still arrived here, not in dreams, but in voice, whispered through wind, encoded in vibration, interpreted by the initiated. Take a breath here with me, because what these men practiced was not ceremony alone. It was continuity. Each day's cycle was a thread in an older pattern, a pattern said to stretch back before the flood, before kingship was lowered, even before cities rose. They believed they were maintaining a signal, that the rituals weren't just echoes, but anchors, holding a connection that might otherwise fray. And in some liturgies, rarely spoken, there are references to other lands, lands where gods also dwell. Not the cities of Sumer, not the mountains of Elam, but distant realms called Dilmun, Ma, and Arali. These are described not as allegories, but as destinations, places from which gods return, places to which they go back. Some scholars interpret these as mythical heavens. Others suggest something else, that the priests of Nippur held not just theological power, but directional memory. They remembered where the gods had gone. And they remembered how to invite them back. As we step into the next section, we look beyond this city, to the gates, the thresholds, the passages through which such beings may have moved. Because if Nippur remembered their presence, then the next question is, how did they travel, and are the doorways still open? When the Sumerians spoke of heaven and earth, they didn't describe a metaphor. They described a connection. One term appears across tablets from Nippur, Uruk, and Lagash. Quietly insistent, always positioned with reverence, Duranki. It translates directly as the bond of heaven and earth. But the word dur also means knot, location, or place where decrees are tied. It's not merely a concept, it is positional, fixed, a junction, a gate. And for them, it wasn't closed. Long before the heavens were seen as remote, the Sumerians imagined them as adjacent, not above in distance, but above in dimension. A realm not visible, but reachable under certain conditions, through certain doors. The Dur-An-Kai wasn't everywhere. It was said to exist specifically at Nippur, within the walls of the Ikur, the mountain house, which had no elevation but served as the axis of vertical contact. Priests and kings visited it not to dream, but to report, to receive, to act upon instructions that, they claimed, came from above. How did the gods move between these realms? The myths offer clues. In the tale of Inanna's descent, the goddess of love and war chooses to leave the upper world and descend into Kur, the underworld. But to do so, she must pass through 7 gates. At each, she removes a symbol of power, her crown, her staff, her necklace, her robe. Only when she stands stripped of all status is she allowed entry. These aren't just gates, they are filters. The story has often been interpreted as a spiritual metaphor, death, transformation, ego death. But its language is technical. Inanna doesn't wander, she follows a sequence. Each gate is named, each transition timed. There is no chaos, only protocol. And when she returns, resurrected by divine assistance, she ascends through the same gates in reverse order. The passage was not spontaneous, it was engineered. In another myth, Enki is said to send emissaries through the field stars, across the paths of heaven, to deliver decrees to distant gods. These aren't dreams, they are transmissions. Enki's temple in Eridu houses the Mi, the decrees of civilization, but it also houses the ladder to the heavens, described not in poetic flourish, but with material familiarity, as if it was once seen. Perhaps this is why ziggurats were built as stair steps. They weren't just towering monuments, they were scaled ascension diagrams. Each level, a realm, each stair, a calibration. The top shrine was not for the people, it was for the moment when contact might be reestablished. Take a moment, let this settle, because across myth, architecture, and ritual, the same idea recurs, that gates existed, that they were opened, and sometimes closed. In Enuma Elish, the cosmic realm is divided by a barrier, a celestial dome separating waters above and below. But Marduk, the champion god, constructs passageways through it, not cracks, designed gates, movement structured into the very fabric of being. One text from Sippar, less known, mentions a ladder of light used by the gods to descend in brightness and return by star mark. Scholars debate its meaning. Some suggest it refers to the Milky Way, others a metaphor for spiritual transcendence. But the verbs used, to descend, to return, are physical, not abstract. And this matters, because for the Sumerians, travel between realms was not impossible, it was managed. Perhaps the gates weren't always open. Perhaps they required timing, alignment, ritual. Some later Akkadian texts speak of days when the gate sings, or when the bolt is loosed and the voice returns. These phrases, when repeated in astronomical contexts, suggest specific celestial events, eclipses, conjunctions, the heliacal rising of rare stars. In other words, conditions, not magic, mechanics. The modern mind searches for technology, for metal, circuitry, propulsion. But what if the Sumerians encoded something subtler, not machine, but permissions, frequencies, dimensional crossings keyed to cosmic rhythm. Even in mourning texts, the departed do not vanish. They go through the gate, sometimes to Kur, sometimes to the stars. The phrase recurs, "He has returned to the path of An," being not only the high God, but the realm of heaven itself. Maybe they believed death was passage. Maybe they remembered that others had taken that path long before. So we return to Dur-Enki, not just a phrase, but a possibility. That Earth once stood in contact, not metaphorically, but actually, and that somewhere, beneath sand, beneath stone, beneath misinterpretation, memory of that access still lives. As we move forward, we follow the signs left behind, not the stories, the maps. Because next, we enter the texts that name other lands, places the gods traveled to, or from. And we ask, if Earth was only one colony, where were the others? When the Sumerians looked to the stars, they did not ask if someone lived out there. They asked where they had gone, because within their stories, their rituals, their records etched into clay, are the names of lands never found on Earth. Places described with detail, but no coordinates. Journeys recorded, but with no return path marked. Destinations spoken of in the same breath as Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur, yet separated not by rivers or deserts, but by silence. The most enduring of these is Dilmun. In the myth Enki and Ninhursag, Dilmun is described as a radiant place, untouched by sickness, drought, or aging. There, the raven does not croak, the lion does not kill. No one says, "I am sick." It is not a land of death, but of origin. Some call it a paradise. Others call it a port, a way station. But where is it? For centuries, scholars sought it in Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf, in distant trade routes, and perhaps those places were named after it. But the earliest references suggest something else. Dilmun is often spoken of as a land where the sun rises, not just east, but above. It is the place where Enki sends gifts, from which emissaries arrive. The verbs used are not speculative, they are logistical. They do not say the gods dreamed of Dilmun. They say they traveled to it. Another realm, Ma, appears in texts associated with Inanna and her journey across the stars. The term Ma is complex, sometimes rendered as land, sometimes as mother, but in celestial contexts it becomes a zone. In the Inanna and A.B. hymn, she declares, "I will go to Ma, where the sky is bent and the path is set." The sky is bent, not broken. The path is set, not random. This doesn't sound like metaphor. It sounds like a route. Then there is Arali, sometimes equated with the underworld, sometimes with a distant western land, always shadowed. In Nergal and Ereshkigal, Arali is the place where the sun dies, but other texts describe it as a field, wide, golden, ruled by unseen lords. It was not hell, it was another domain. Some even describe it as inhabited by beings whose names are not known on Earth. If these were stories alone, they might be dismissed, but their structure matters. The Sumerians listed these places alongside known cities. Their trade lists, recovered from tablets in Ebla and Mari, mention Dilmun alongside Elam and Susa. Yet unlike those cities, Dilmun has no ziggurat, no governor, no records of rebellion or tribute, only arrivals, only gifts, only light. Perhaps that's what distinguished it. It was never conquered, only visited. And who managed those visits? In several Sumerian texts, especially those preserved in later Akkadian copies, we find references to the assembly of 50. Ostensibly, it refers to the gathering of the Anunnaki, Enlil, Anu, Enki, Ninhursag, and 46 others. But who are the rest? The tablets do not name them all, only the leaders. The number, though, 50, is precise, not a generality, and it matches another Sumerian pattern, the list of heavenly stations. The MUL.APIN star compendium, compiled around 1000 BCE, but based on Sumerian data, lists dozens of stars, grouped by function, brightness, and motion. Not alphabetically, not by proximity, but by role. It's possible the assembly of 50 referred not just to gods, but to locations, or intelligences assigned to them. One tablet found at Nineveh even describes an assembly where each lord of place stands to receive instruction, some described with names, others only as the Bright One, or he who keeps the sixth field. Fields of what? Fields of light. Fields of assignment. One entry from the Temple Hymns, translated by Samuel Noah Kramer, mentions a god who left from the third station to deliver the decree of the seventh, and returned by way of the rising gate. These aren't dreamscapes, they are roots, and in texts like the Enki and the World Order, there is an unsettling precision. Enki dispatched orders to the corners, to the south, the gift of reeds, to the north, the copper birds, to the far west, the city of arrival. Arrival? From where? Or to where? Let's pause here. Because it's possible the Sumerians were not just imagining divine lands. They were preserving memories of an expanded geography, one not measured in miles, but in permissions, in vibrational coordinates, in rituals timed to openings. The priests of Nippur did not chant about heaven in abstraction. They sang of gates, passageways, cycles, and stations. The gods, they believed, moved between these zones. Earth was one of them, but not the only one. Maybe the ziggurats were not just upward prayers. Maybe they were attempts to restore the network. And if Earth was a node, then the others may still exist, somewhere, or somewhen, still reachable if one knows the songs. As we step forward, we'll explore the places hidden beneath, because not all memories point upward. Some descend, and in the next section, we go below. When we speak of ziggurats, we imagine their height, tiered platforms reaching for the heavens, bathed in sunlight and starlight. But what the eye seldom sees, and what few ever entered, was what lay beneath. Because under the ziggurats of Sumer, there are levels not open to ritual procession or royal decree. Hidden chambers, sealed corridors, foundations that whisper a different kind of purpose, quiet, deliberate, and maybe older than the cities built upon them. In Eridu, beneath the ruins of Enki's Eabzu temple, archaeologists found something unexpected. Using ground-penetrating radar during the late 1990s and again in 2006, researchers mapped multiple subterranean anomalies, rectilinear voids beneath the visible floor plan, some aligned with buried aquifers. No staircases led to them. No surface entrances remained. They appeared placed, intentionally. One measured approximately 3.2 by 2.4 meters, too small for storage, too well-shaped to be natural. Inside, fragments of gypsum-lined brick, shards of black bitumen, and copper residue were recovered. No inscriptions, no statues, just material and silence. What were they? Some scholars argue these were foundations, ritual caches sealed to dedicate the temple's power. Others believe they functioned like crypts, containers of sacred presence. But the water, the bitumen, the metal, suggest something more engineered, more interactive, perhaps functional. The Sumerians believed that beneath the Eabzu lay the Abzu itself, the primeval deep, a watery realm that both birthed and sustained life. but they didn't. Located in myth, they located it physically under Enki's temple. Texts describe priests drawing living water from hidden wells, feeding it through channels carved beneath the floor, then releasing it during offerings. This wasn't symbolic, it was measured, calibrated. Water as medium, not just for ritual, but for memory. Bitumen-lined tunnels beneath ziggurats were waterproof. But more than that, they were resonant. Bitumen, dense, viscous, naturally echoic, alter sound and temperature. A whisper in one of these chambers vibrates longer. A drum beat carries lower. If tones were part of ritual, these chambers may have acted as amplifiers. And water, it remembers vibration. Modern science shows that water structure can change briefly based on frequency input. Sumerian myths long preceded this observation, yet they paired water and sound obsessively. Prayers were spoken over flowing water. Names were recited into copper vessels. Temples were washed with words. Were they encoding or preserving? In Nippur, beneath the Ekor temple, similar anomalies exist. A sealed vault beneath the main platform, discovered during 19th century digs and revisited with digital imaging in 2003, was found to contain a slab of polished limestone atop a clay-lined depression. It bore no markings, but the limestone was smooth as glass. Geologists dated it to 2200 BCE. Why build a chamber no one would enter? Why polish a surface no one would see? Unless it was meant to receive something else, something not visible. Let's pause here, because if ziggurats replicated the sky in their rise, what if they also mirrored the deep in their base? In Enki and the world order, the god of wisdom activates the me, civilization's blueprints, by entering the Abzu and speaking their names aloud. Each command is uttered, then sealed. The texts imply that sound triggered their power, and that water carried it forward. Temples like those at Uruk, Ur, and Eridu all share a structural oddity. A central well or shaft beneath the innermost shrine, often lined with fired brick and encircled by stone. These are not wells for drinking. They are too narrow, too deep. In some cases, they do not even reach groundwater, but they reach something, a point, a chamber, a resonance pocket. Maybe they weren't meant to draw water, but to listen through it, as if waiting for a signal, a return transmission. Even the later Babylonian ziggurat of Etemenanki, the so-called Tower of Babel, contained a foundation chamber described as the place where the waters speak. Priests were forbidden to descend, yet maintained it ritually. Once a year, they poured oil into its center. They waited to see if it formed a circle or was swallowed. The results were interpreted as omens, but perhaps they were readings. This possibility isn't proof, but it aligns. Because the Sumerians saw memory not as an abstraction, but as a physical medium. They believed words could be stored in stone, that names, once spoken correctly, awakened functions. The me were not scrolls, they were vibrations. Maybe that's why temples were always rebuilt on the same spot, not out of tradition, but because something remained underneath. Not just ruins, but presence. And as we move forward, we'll follow the clues not in tunnels, but in sky records. Because the next section explores alignments, and the frequencies those alignments once tuned. When the wind passed through the upper tiers of the ziggurat at Ur during equinox, it did not whistle randomly. It resonated. A low hum, imperceptible to most, but tuned. The ancient architects had designed its hollow corridors and stair-lined platforms not just to withstand weight, but to channel air, echo footsteps, and, some believe, sing during particular celestial events. To the Sumerians, architecture was not static, it was harmonic. And nowhere is this clearer than in their reverence for the me, the divine decrees. In the myth Enki and the world order, the god of water and wisdom receives, stores, and distributes these me, which governed everything from law and medicine to weaving, song, and kingship. They weren't just concepts. They were treated as active properties, described as placed in chambers, awakened by name, sealed in voice. Enki is said to have spoken the me into the waters, allowing them to flow to the temples of the cities. Were these just stories or instructions? Because each city's temple had its own orientation, its own timing, its own sacred calendar, not based on politics, not on preference, but on celestial mechanics. In Uruk, Inanna's temple was aligned with Venus's 8-year cycle, rising and setting at the same points every 584 days. In Nippur, Enlil's shrine aligned with solstice sunrises and the seasonal arc of the moon. The rituals of each city matched not only local seasons, but planetary motion. These weren't holidays. They were frequencies. Take a breath with me. Let's feel that for a moment. The gods were not just honored in time. They were summoned in rhythm. In modern physics, resonance occurs when a system vibrates at a specific frequency that matches the input. Glass shatters at its resonant frequency. Bridges hum. Even the Earth itself vibrates at around 7.83 Hertz, the Schumann resonance. What if the Sumerians knew this, not as numbers, but as experience? If temples were tuned by proportion, by material, by orientation, then ritual wasn't just symbolic, it was functional. When priests sang hymns timed to the moonrise, when bells rang through corridors, when water flowed across stepped altars, they weren't performing, they were activating. Even their texts support this. In one cylinder seal inscription, a priest describes striking the stone that sings, referring to a slab used during an eclipse rite. At Eridu, fragments of baked clay bearing harmonic marks, indentations, spaced by ratio, not distance, have been interpreted by some as musical or vibrational notation, not for melody, for timing. The me, then, may have been more than law. They may have been harmonic codes, stored in word, unlocked in sound, and shared through temple architecture. Some temples were built to the phi ratio, what modern math calls the golden ratio. Others followed square root proportions tied to lunar intervals. These weren't guesses. These were traditions passed across generations, instructions etched into brick dimensions and stair counts. The ziggurat of Ur, for example, contains a total of 91 steps, a number divisible by 13 lunar months of 28 days, each step representing a half day of lunar visibility across seasonal rotation. Coincidence or calibration? The idea of temples that sing appears not just in myth, but in architecture. In Babylon, the Temple of Marduk was said to emit the breath of order during festival nights. In texts from Sippar, a temple is described as the ear that hears the sky. These weren't poetic titles. They reflected function, that the structure could receive, could transmit. Even the Sumerian word for temple, simply means house. But in compound forms, Gao, great house, Misara, house of cosmic law, we see layered meaning. A house not of stone, but of signal. If sound carries pattern, and pattern carries memory, then perhaps the rituals were not about asking. They were about remembering how to match. Match tone to temple, temple to star, star to cycle. Because to the Sumerians, time wasn't a line. It was a loop, a rhythm of return, every planetary movement was a re-invitation. Every festival, a reenactment of something real that had already occurred, and might again. Perhaps that's why the me were always described as recoverable, not destroyed, just scattered, like frequencies, waiting to be tuned in again. As we step into the next section, we leave architecture and sound. We return to the stars, to the sky maps not drawn in sand, but pressed into clay. Because what came next were charts, and they may show not where we looked, but where others once departed. When the stars rose over Mesopotamia, they weren't seen as distant, they were seen as remembered. And the Sumerians did not simply watch the night sky, they stored it into clay, not as art, but as record. Among the most astonishing of these records is the Mul-Apian, a star compendium preserved in cuneiform, dated to around 1000 BCE, but widely believed to contain information passed down from Sumerian and Akkadian sources, at least a millennium earlier. Its name means the plow star, referring to the constellation we now associate with Orion. But Mul-Apian is not a single story. It is a system, a tablet etched with lists of stars, planetary paths, heliacal risings, conjunctions, seasonal markers, and horizon points. And yet, for all its observational precision, it reads not only as a calendar, it reads like a manual. The stars are grouped not just by region, but by function, each assigned a role, a position, a pattern of return. Some are described as watchers of the path, others as those who do not return. One entry refers to the road of Enlil, another to the field of Anu. These were not poetic labels, they were zones of operation, and the tone is logistical, not devotional. Mul-Apin includes time intervals for the movement of Jupiter, Venus, and Mars, descriptions of their disappearance and return, durations of invisibility, instructions for calculating eclipses. It even lists when certain stars rise 2 fingers above the gate. A gate, not a horizon. What kind of observer calls the sky a gate? And what exactly passes through it? Let's pause here. Take a breath, because something in these tablets suggests more than measurement. It suggests memory of how the stars moved when something else moved with them. The Sumerians didn't draw maps like we do, but their ziggurats, ritual calendars, and clay records were all based on sky events. Their understanding of sidereal time, the method of measuring a day by the return of a star to the same place, was advanced. Even today, sidereal clocks are used in telescopes. The Sumerians used them in temples. Each city had its own alignment. Ur to the moon, Uruk to Venus, Nippur to the polar star. The stars weren't passive, they were interactive. Their shifts signaled rituals, their absences triggered prayers, and sometimes departures. Some researchers believe Mul-Apin and related tablets function not just as observational guides, but as departure frameworks, maps of when conditions were right to ascend. Not spiritually, but literally. Other ancient sites suggest this was not a regional practice. Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, predates Sumerian cities by thousands of years. Its megalithic enclosures, especially Enclosure D, are oriented toward the rising of Sirius around 9000 BCE. Carvings of vultures, scorpions, and bending sky forms hint at constellations. Was this a proto-star map? A tracking station? In Egypt, the Dendera zodiac shows planetary bodies orbiting in structured paths, long before heliocentric models were accepted. Temples aligned not only with the Nile, but with the stars. The Benben stone, placed in temple spires, was said to return light to the heavens. In the Indus Valley, we find standardized city plans with drains that align to solstice light. Vedic texts from the same culture describe nakshatras, lunar mansions, mapped across the sky, each governing a segment of time and purpose. In Mesoamerica, the Maya encoded planetary cycles into codices and stone. The Dresden Codex predicts Venus's rising with a margin of error of less than a day. Pyramid steps match solar calendars. Cities align to eclipses. Across oceans, across millennia, sky watching as a shared inheritance. Was it all symbolic, or was it functional? A memory shared across civilizations, not through trade, but through origin? Perhaps. And perhaps that's why the MUL.A pin lists stars as fixed, wandering, returning, and non-returning. The last group is never explained. Stars that rose once, then vanished. Was it simple atmospheric error? Or were they tracking something that came once, then left? Not a star, a vessel, or a station, or a gate. The Sumerians believed that the stars were not gods themselves, but paths to them. Their hymns describe the stairways of the sky, the fields of return, and the places of crossing. Their kings waited for favorable alignments to build, to marry, to judge, to speak. Perhaps they were also waiting for a time when return was possible, not metaphorically, but physically. The MUL.A PIN ends not with prophecy, but with position. A final list of stellar arrangements marking thresholds of transition. The last line, rarely translated, reads, "When all are in place, the road is open." Perhaps it was just a poetic flourish, or perhaps it was instruction. As we step forward into the final stages of this story, we return to a larger question. Not what they saw, but what they remembered, and what they left buried in time. When the Anunnaki came to Earth, if we trust the oldest Sumerian accounts, they did not arrive with celebration. They arrived with assignment. In the earliest myth cycles, their descent is not painted in triumph, but in burden. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods are weary. They dig canals. They manage floods, they maintain order, and in time, they rebel. It is not humanity that rebels first, but the gods themselves. They are tired. This alone sets the Sumerian tradition apart. Divinity in these texts is not omnipotent. It is obligated. The labor grows heavy. And so, they create humans, not from inspiration, but from need. A solution to their fatigue. A workforce designed to relieve them of toil. In clay tablets from Sippar and Asher, this is not framed as cruelty, but as administration, a decision made in council, a plan enacted across the layers of heaven and earth. But the question lingers. If they were gods, why did they grow weary? And deeper still, why did they stay? Because across multiple stories, the divine presence on earth is temporary, or reluctant, or exilic. In the Enuma Elish, after Marduk defeats Tiamat and organizes the world, he is given rule of earth and builds temples not to live in, but to visit. He delegates, assigns, returns skyward. In Enki and the World Order, we are told that each god is sent to a land, a city, a task, not chosen, not volunteered, sent. Even Enlil, the chief of gods, is said to have descended not with joy, but with storm. His temple in Nippur is a place of judgment, not peace. Perhaps most haunting is the language of regret. In laments like the destruction of Sumer and Ur, gods are portrayed as weeping after withdrawing. They abandon their temples. They turn their faces from cities. And the tone is mournful, not wrathful, as if they loved what they could no longer bear to be part of. Maybe they were never meant to stay, or maybe they couldn't. Take a moment with this. Because within these texts, divinity is not static. It shifts, it comes close, then recedes. There is love, but distance, presence, then departure. The lament for Eridu speaks of a house sealed by silence, of a gate no longer opened. The god does not die, he leaves. The Sumerians seem to know this was part of the pattern. They built temples as homes, yes, but also as memory holders. Rituals were not designed to summon, but to sustain, as if to keep a fading echo alive. And still, some myths suggest that even the gods resented the stay. In Inanna's descent, the goddess voluntarily enters the underworld, perhaps seeking wisdom, perhaps escape. But once there, she is trapped, silent, forgotten. She is only revived through the intervention of others. In Nergal and Ereshkigal, the god of war and plague is forced to remain in the underworld as consort after breaking rules of conduct. His cries are recorded in hymns. Why must I be sealed below? My chariot no longer rides the wind. Divinity, in exile, and exile not from heaven, but from home. Perhaps Earth was never meant to be a domain of rest. Perhaps it was a project, a mission, a correction, or a consequence. Some scholars suggest these myths reflect agricultural cycles. Others, the politics of conquest and withdrawal. But when we read them patiently, across tablets, across cities, across centuries, a common thread appears. The gods worked, the gods suffered, the gods left. One text from Girsu refers to a god assigned for a time, but not for the turning of the stars. The phrase implies duration, limits, a sentence, not a reign. And yet, Earth was not hated. In the hymns, Enki blesses the marshes, the reeds, the waters of the south. Inanna weeps for her temples. Even Enlil, cold and stormy, is described standing alone on the city wall before he departs. They cared, but they could not remain. So was Earth a punishment? Or was it something more difficult? A lesson? The temples, in their structure, suggest hope for return. The stairways, the gates, the calendars, all designed to match patterns in the sky. As if to say, we remember where you came from, we remember how you arrived, and maybe, if the harmony is right, you'll come again. Or perhaps they never fully left. Perhaps what we call divine withdrawal is not distance, but frequency shift, not absence, but silence. And if so, then the question is not why the gods departed, but whether we've forgotten how to listen. As we enter the final arc of this story, we return to memory, not as history, but as something encoded into place, into sky, into breath. Because the final chapters are not about the gods, they are about us. If Earth was only one station, one post in a greater network, then the question grows louder. Where were the others? Not in clay tablets, but in memory, in songs, in symbols, in cities aligned to stars that should not matter, yet somehow always did. Because Earth's earliest civilizations, separated by oceans, mountain ranges, entire language trees, somehow shared a pattern. They tracked the same stars. They whispered the same numbers. They described gods with similar faces, traveling in sky-borne craft, bringing knowledge, and often departing. How? And more deeply, why? Let's begin with the Dogon people of Mali. For centuries, their cosmology was preserved orally. No writing, no telescopes. Yet their priests describe Sirius as a binary star system. One visible, the other invisible. A seed of heavy darkness. Western astronomers confirmed Sirius B's existence in the 20th century. An ultra-dense white dwarf, invisible to the naked eye. The Dogon also speak of Nomo, beings who descended in a vessel that spun and landed in a thunder of wind. They were teachers, twin spirits, amphibious, messengers. From where? The Dogon call it Po-Tolo, the deep beginning. Across the ocean, the Maya tracked Venus with breathtaking precision. The Dresden Codex plots its rise and disappearance over 584-day cycles, syncing with their rituals of sacrifice and renewal. Their gods, Kukulkan and Itzamna, arrived from the sky, bringing calendars, speech, and measurement. Their pyramids are tuned not just to solstices, but to eclipses, Venus conjunctions, and celestial crossroads. Not decoration, instruction. In the Vedic tradition, the ancient Sanskrit texts describe Devas and Asuras, celestial beings who war across realms. The Rig Veda speaks of flying vehicles called vimanas, some disc-shaped, some pillar-like, powered by sound, fire, or mantra. The stars are not just objects. They are residences. The seven sages, the Saptarishi, are tied to the stars of the Big Dipper. The Devas dwell in Svarga, a heavenly station reached by alignment, not death. In Egypt, the gods came from Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age when beings called Neteru arrived on boats of light. Thoth, the god of wisdom, is linked to the moon and to Sirius, Osiris to Orion, Isis to Sirius B. Their temples were not built randomly. The Great Pyramid of Giza aligns precisely with true north, and its shafts target Orion's belt and Sirius during specific epochs. Was this convergence coincidence, or was it memory, shared and reinterpreted? Take a breath with me, because this is where the question changes. It's no longer just, where were the other colonies? It becomes, how do we recognize one when we see it? Must a colony leave machinery, architecture, or is it enough that it leaves a pattern? The repeating number 72, used to calculate the precession of the equinoxes, appears in Sumer, Egypt, the Maya, and Vedic India. It's the number of years it takes the stars to shift 1 degree on the horizon, a slow drift, almost imperceptible, unless watched across generations. Why did civilizations with no contact all care about it? Unless they were taught to, unless they remembered to. The Sumerians told of Dilmun, Ma, and Arali, the Egyptians of Aru, Duat, and the Field of Reeds, the Hindus of Bhuloka, Devaloka, and the 7 lokas above, the Maya of Xibalba, Tamawanchan, and the World Tree's branches. Each culture mapped Earth not as a center, but as a node, a layer, a crossing, a middle place. And perhaps that's the point. A colony does not need to be vast. It needs to be intentional. What makes a colony real? Is it ruins, wires, power cells, or is it language, alignment, recurrence? The Sumerians framed their temples to receive the heavens. The Dogon memorized star systems without tools. The Maya built mirrors of Venus. The Egyptians recorded the weighing of the heart beside gates that mirrored stars. And all of them said the same thing. The gods came, taught, departed, promised return. What do we do with that? Dismiss it as archetype, or entertain the idea that the memory is older than the civilizations that preserved it? Perhaps Earth was never colonized in the way empires imagine. Perhaps it was cultivated, watched, taught, left to remember through song and structure. And if that's true, then every city aligned to Sirius, every temple echoing solstice sunrise, every chant naming gods who came from above is part of the map. The question is no longer whether the others existed. The question is whether we're willing to see them. Even now, as we approach the closing arc of this story, we'll ask one final question, not about where they were, but about what they left in us. Because some colonies don't leave structures. They leave memory. And sometimes that's harder to erase. When we look at the ancient world through modern eyes, we often imagine ourselves as the first generation capable of asking cosmic questions with seriousness. Yet, the desire to understand where we came from and whether someone might come again is far older than telescopes, missions, or science fiction. It is woven into clay tablets, temple hymns, and the quiet architecture of memory. And in recent times, this memory has been reinterpreted, expanded, challenged, distorted, and rediscovered by voices both scholarly and fringe. One of the most influential, whether one agrees with him or not, is Zecharia Sitchin, whose books on the Anunnaki reframed Mesopotamian mythology as a literal history of extraterrestrial intervention. His work, controversial and widely debated, did not arise from nowhere. It emerged from a cultural hunger, a wish to reconnect with stories that once held Earth in a wider cosmic landscape. Sitchin argued that the gods were travelers from another world, that Nibiru was a hidden planet with an elongated orbit, and that humanity was engineered as a labor force. These claims have been challenged by Assyriologists, astronomers, and historians who emphasize that the original texts are symbolic, theological, and poetic. Yet even within those critiques, something lingers. The acknowledgement that ancient Mesopotamians did imagine beings who arrived, worked, judged, and departed. The debate itself reveals something important. We are still asking the same questions the Sumerians asked. Not about Nibiru specifically, but about belonging, about purpose, about the possibility that humanity is not alone, and perhaps never was. And this longing to be part of something greater surfaces in unlikely places. Even in NASA, during the mid-20th century, when the early space program began naming lunar features after Sumerian and Akkadian deities. Craters on the moon bear names like Enki, Shamash, and Ninurta. Space probes and tracking systems once labeled their calibration points with references to MUL.A.PIN star lists. Engineers, working far from temples, far from rituals, returned instinctively to the earliest sky watchers. Why? Because those ancient astronomers were the first to map the heavens with systematic precision. They were scientists long before science existed, but also because their myths, even stripped of divinity, still carry the emotional truth of longing for connection, of wanting the sky to be more than empty light. And maybe that longing still shapes us. Take a breath here. Feel the quiet around you. Because beneath the academic debates and the fringe interpretations lies something more intimate. The psychological desire for companionship in the universe. The feeling that Earth is not an isolated experiment, drifting alone in vastness, but part of a larger pattern, one colony among many, one note in a cosmic sequence, one chapter in a story that began before us and may continue beyond us. This desire doesn't come from ignorance. It comes from memory. Every culture preserved some version of descent myths, gods who came down, taught, departed, and promised return. The Sumerians had the Anunnaki. The Maya had Kukulkan. The Egyptians had Osiris and Isis as star beings from Orion and Sirius. The Dogon had Nomo. The Vedic texts had devas traveling across Loka realms. These weren't merely fantasies. They were frameworks for understanding meaning. They offered comfort in uncertainty, structure in chaos, hope in hardship, and they held a recurring motif, the cycle of visitation, arrival, guidance, withdrawal, return. Modern theories, whether scholarly or speculative, inherit this pattern. Sitchin's interpretations, for all their errors, resonate emotionally because they echo ancient patterns of expectation. NASA's naming conventions echo the same acknowledgement that our earliest efforts to reach outward belong to a lineage that began thousands of years ago. Even contemporary fiction, films, and philosophies repeat the motif: contact, silence, anticipation, the possibility that something once known may become known again. Is this projection, or is it cultural inheritance? Perhaps those are not opposites, because myths do not survive for millennia unless they speak to something enduring within the human condition. The desire for return is not a flaw. It is a continuity, a thread woven through the collective psyche. And you can feel it even now when people look up at the sky during meteor showers, eclipses, or planetary alignments. There is a moment, brief but unmistakable, when the ancient and the modern collapse into one sensation. What if tonight is the night something comes back? Not as fear, not as spectacle, but as recognition. In the Sumerian laments, when the gods leave their temples, the people do not curse them. They wait, they mourn, they preserve rituals. They keep the memory alive, not because they cannot move on, but because they believe the story is not finished. That someday the gates will open. That the Dur and Kai, the bond between heaven and earth, will resonate again. This idea is not about proof. It is about pattern. If Earth was one colony, and if those who came once departed, then legacy becomes not buildings or machines, but expectation, hope, the willingness to remain attentive, the courage to imagine reconnection. And so the cycle continues. We observe the heavens. We name their features. We speculate on origins. We explore, inch by inch, the cosmic sea, not to reclaim the past, but to follow its trajectory. As we move now toward the final section, we shift from the vast sweep of myth and history back into quiet reflection, into stillness. Because the last chapter isn't about return, it's about the space we hold for silence, and for whatever might one day break it. When all the stories fall quiet, and the tablets return to their shelves of dust and shadow, something gentle happens in the mind. The noise of theories softens. The questions that once pressed hard against our curiosity begin to drift, widening into calm, and the ruins, those patient silhouettes of mud brick and memory, settle again into the timeless rhythm of the desert. Here at the end of our exploration, we come back to the oldest companions of human thought: wind, starlight, and stone. If you picture Eridu now, not as a city of priests and canals, but as a quiet rise of earth beneath the evening sky, you may understand why the ancients believed the world had once held more than human footsteps. The sand lies cool over broken tablet fragments, each shard shaped by hands that lived before history began, and the air carries the same faint scent of salt water that drifted in from the marshes thousands of years ago. Nothing moves quickly here. Even time seems to walk with care, choosing its steps. You can almost imagine someone standing at this place long before you, looking out across the darkening plain. Maybe they were a priest, maybe a child, maybe a traveler passing through a land older than their lineage. And perhaps, as the first stars appeared, they felt the same question rise that we feel now. What else is out there? Not in fear, not in certainty, but in wonder. A wonder that has followed humanity from the earliest nights to this one. Take a breath here. Let the quiet settle around you, the way the desert settles around old stone. Because when we look at these ruins today, we're not only studying what the Anunnaki meant to the Sumerians, or how Earth may have been imagined as one colony among many. We're also looking at ourselves, our longing to belong, our hope that we're part of a larger pattern, our willingness to listen for meaning in the spaces between explanations. This desire for connection doesn't end when the story closes. It stays with us, like an echo that outlives the voice. Some memories sleep in stone. Others ride the silence between worlds. The ruins keep what they can, holding inscriptions that crumble slowly yet faithfully. The sky keeps the rest, carrying the faint glow of stars that were old long before the first brick of Eridu was laid. Neither gives answers, neither needs to. They simply remain, offering presence instead of certainty. You might notice how calm it feels when the story shifts from movement to stillness. The debates fade, the distant theories soften. What remains is the simple truth that Earth has always been part of a much larger unknown. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, travelers, symbols, or metaphors for forces we still barely understand, they left us with one enduring inheritance: the idea that our world is not isolated, that there are layers of existence still beyond our reach, still patient in their unfolding. Maybe that is enough, because even without clear proof, the feeling persists that we stand inside a universe that remembers more than it reveals. The ancients expressed that memory through myths of descent and return, through stories of gates in the sky and beings who walked among fields and temples. We, in our own age, express the same longing through telescopes and probes and quiet midnight questions. And both forms of seeking carry dignity. Listen for a moment. Wind still moves across Eridu. Stars still wait in their patient arcs. Stone still remembers the weight of hands that shaped it. Nothing in this landscape feels abandoned. It simply rests the way a closed book rests, containing more than it shows at first glance. And we, standing at the edge of this ancient silence, become part of its unfolding. Not because we expect return, not because we claim knowledge, but because we're willing to be present with mystery. As the night deepens, the horizon blends into a soft blur of shadow and starlight. The ruins breathe quietly. The questions remain untouched, unhurried. And somewhere in this stillness, you sense a gentle closing, not final, just a pause, as if the story is exhaling before another long silence. And so we leave it here, where wind carries memory, where stone holds its secrets, and where the sky waits with the patience of ages, ready someday to be asked again.